Well, Dickie is over here with these wild schemes, leaking stories to the newspaper so that he can sort of manipulate the future of his friend. He doesn't want Edward VIII to know about it. God forbid David find out that he's actually over here trying to stand in the way of his great love story. So he decides to present himself as a loyal supporter. It was November 25th that this whole thing happened, but by December 7th, he's decided what his plan will be as far as continuing his relationship with Edward VIII. And Dickie writes to him and says, "I can't bear to be sitting here doing nothing to help you in your terrible trouble. Do you realize how many loyal supporters of all classes you have? If you want me to help you, to do any service for you, or even to feel you have a friend of Wallace to keep you company, you have only to telephone. I don't want to be a nuisance, but I hate to feel that there's nothing I can do to help except to bite people's heads off who have the temerity to say anything disloyal about their king, and there are practically none who do so, at any rate in my presence." That is such a manipulative little passage, and it's very thinly veiled as manipulation. I mean, him being like, "I'll come and sit with you," even if you just want somebody who understands why you like Wallace. I mean, that's a lie. He didn't like Wallace. He didn't like Wallace at all. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise, and today we are doing chapter 10 of the Mountbattens. This is a really good chapter because we finally got to the part in the story where we have reached the abdication. Edward VIII has cast his eye to Wallace Simpson. He's thrown his old girlfriend out the back door, and now he has only eyes for the divorced American. Actually, she's not divorced yet. She's going to get divorced, but who cares? She's estranged from her husband, and it's only a matter of time. So he is fully invested in pursuing Wallace Simpson. He could care less about the throne. He's willing to cast that to the side if only he could be with his girlfriend. So we've got drama kicking up. And Dickie is trying to figure out how he can sort of thread the needle in this very precarious situation. Because long ago, he had cast in his lot with the prince, and he had made inroads there and become best friends with Edward VIII. You'll recall this from earlier chapters. It was very clever of him. But now Edward looks like he's a crazy person, because he is a crazy person, and it's all beginning to come to light. So what does he do now? His ticket to ride had been Edward, but now Edward's jumping off the train with Wallace Simpson and being like, "You coming?" And Dickie's like, but how does he tell Edward that he wants to distance himself, right? At the beginning of all of the drama of the abdication, Dickie was siding more with Edward. By the end of things, he's distanced himself, but there's all these platitudes and excuses and "I hate that everyone's making me do this. I really wish I could stand by your side. Oh no, what am I going to do? This is the worst." I mean, you understand. I think we really start to see in this chapter a little bit more about how manipulative Dickie is and how he's kind of a double talker. Tell this person what they need to hear, tell this person what they need to hear, but always in the pursuit of his own goals. So he's been a pretty likable fellow, and I wouldn't say that he's like a terrible person. I think anybody who found themselves in this situation would struggle with, what do I do now? Because he always had a good time with Edward VIII, but as far as is he king material? Obviously and clearly not. So his abdicating the throne, even Dickie can see that's probably the best. He's really come to like Bertie, despite all of the things that Prince of Wales had to say about him. The abdication is a portion of this story, but there's a whole lot of other things that's going on in the family. The name of the chapter is Problems in the Family, and they've got big problems. And it isn't just Edwina and Dickie and their terrible marriage. I mean, that's been the theme this entire time. That, of course, is still going to be problematic, but we have even greater problems. People are dying, all sorts of things. So let's go ahead and get into this. It begins by saying that in January 1936, King George V died, and Dickie's best man was finally the king. Remember, Dickie had Edward VIII as his best man, and of course, Edward is going to want Dickie to reciprocate when he marries Wallace, but that's all going to come crumbling apart. Anyway, they met after the funeral, and he wrote in his diary, "Talked with David till 3 o'clock in the morning. Very satisfactory." Mountbatten had stayed in touch with his old friend and would visit him when he was in Britain. Edward's Windsor home, Fort Belvedere, was only an hour's away from Adstein, and during that first part of 1934, Dickie had visited at least twice a month, often staying for dinner and the night. When Edward came to inspect the shell of Brooke House in October 1934, it was Wallace who came with him. The couples had briefly been neighbors at Bryanston Court a few months earlier. Now, the reality of the situation is the Mountbattens didn't like Edwina. trashy, was what that situation was. And they didn't particularly care for how David / Edward / Prince Wales / King of the Empire had treated Freda Dudley Ward. They had watched him all but abandon her, and he didn't even break up with her in any kind of proper manner. He told the switchboard, just stop letting her calls come in. I'm done with that. I've moved on to greener pastures. And so they thought that was a gross way to treat somebody, but particularly when the object of his affections was Wallace, they couldn't understand why he would bother himself to go after her the way that he did. And Wallace didn't really like the Mountbattens in return. The author says that in Dickie, Wallace recognized a fellow careerist, and she was also very jealous of Edwina because Edwina had all that upper-class charm and natural beauty, says the book. I think that could be challenged, but that's what the book says, and maybe that's how Wallace felt. You know, everybody went to great pains to say how ugly Wallace was, but I think in her own way, she was kind of pretty. Maybe pretty's not the right word, but she was interesting to look at. She certainly had nice clothes, and that's probably why she always wore such nice clothes, because she was so insecure about her actual face. But I never thought that she was some kind of a hag. I think later on she looked a bit haggish, but I think I've seen pictures of her where I'm like, I don't know why she was so insecure about her jaw. Everyone acted like her jaw was so big. She did kind of have a big jaw, but I mean, I don't know. I think that there are like worse things. Anyway, in spite of the harsh feelings between the two of them, they sort of made do when they had to be around each other. And Dickie and Edwina saw much of the new king and Wallace Simpson that year. In late May, they had dinner at York House with the Simpsons, the Duff Coopers, and Airman Charles Lindbergh, Stanley Baldwin, and their wives. In late June, Wallace stayed for several nights at Adstein, oddly bringing with her a cold chicken as some sort of, hostess gift. Much to the chagrin of the Mountbattens cook. I can imagine. That's an odd thing to bring. I'm all for bringing a hostess gift. God forbid you show up at somebody's house without anything. But a cold chicken? Okay. Different. I can't decide why she did that. I mean, for somebody as calculated and for somebody who worked so hard to make sure she knew all the rules of the upper echelon, it's a weird move to bring a cold chicken. It couldn't have been out of ignorance. But what does it mean? Who knows? They all went vacationing together, and what should have been a good time was, of course, not, because, I mean, look who's been thrown in a boat together. Some of the biggest nut jobs the world has ever produced. But accompanying King and Wallace, as they cruised the Dalmatian coast for 10 days in their yacht, were the Mountbattens and the Duff Coopers and Hugh Mullinex. And the Duke kept acting like he was going to try to travel inconspicuously. He wants to travel as the Duke of Lancaster so that, he can have all his privacy. And yet, how is that going to happen when they were escorted by 2 British destroyers and a Yugoslav torpedo boat? And were constantly being saluted with a 21-gun salute. So I'm not really sure how he actually thought that he was going to get away with traveling inconspicuously under a pseudonym, but okay, delusional. But what part of David's way of going through life would ever lend me to think he would be logical about anything? The trip was marred by various mishaps, from crashing into a bridge to Edward falling out of a motorboat. They did have a professional golfer with them who donated 3,000 golf balls, which mostly went overboard, to help the new king's pitching and driving. Okay, so I guess they had fun with that. At the end of September, they were at Balmoral with the king, and the abdication rumblings began. Because he wants to marry Wallace Simpson, but we all know the story. He can't marry Wallace Simpson. She's a divorcee. And nobody wants him with her. She has no right. She has no business being with the king. And so everybody's got their say. The Simpsons were divorcing at the end of October, which would mean that now Wallace was available to the king. And the abdication crisis began with maneuvering between the king and his staff and Stanley Baldwin and his cabinet and the church. An inside source on the abdication crisis, as it played out during the autumn, was Charles Lamb, whom Dickie had inveigled as Edward's equerry. Now, here's the deal. Dickie has his fingers and hands all up in this business. Because at the beginning, he did not want Edward VIII to abdicate the throne. He thought that was a poor choice. And so there are rumors that he was involved in leaking a story to a really rather irrelevant and insignificant paper called The Week. And the editor had been offered some choice gossip. And that little bit of gossip was this, that Wallace Simpson had been having an affair with a car salesman named Guy Trundle. And by leaking this information to the press, there was a hope that Edward VIII would not go forward marrying Wallace Simpson now that this horrible gossip was wreathed around her and now that this had all come to light. And then he could stay on the throne and even he would see, you can't marry this person. She's not in love with you. Look, she's going and having an affair with a car salesman. She's not your sort. You got a little confused, but now you know. But at the last minute, they got cold feet, pulled the story and was like, oh, forget about it. Sorry, never mind. But while Dickie is over here with these wild schemes, leaking stories to the newspaper so that he can sort of manipulate the future of his friend, he doesn't want Edward VIII to know about it. God forbid David find out that he's actually over here trying to stand in the way of his great love story. So he decides to present himself as a loyal supporter, It was November 25th that this whole thing happened, but by December 7th, he's decided what his plan will be as far as continuing his relationship with Edward VIII. And Dickie writes to him and says, I can't bear to be sitting here doing nothing to help you in your terrible trouble. Do you realize how many loyal supporters of all classes you have? If you want me to help you, to do any service for you, or even to feel you have a friend of Wallace to keep you company, you have only to telephone. I don't want to be a nuisance, but I hate to feel that there's nothing I can do to help except to bite people's heads off who have the temerity to say anything disloyal about their king. And there are practically none who do so, at any rate in my presence. That is such a manipulative little passage, and it's very thinly veiled as manipulation. I mean, him being like, I'll come and sit with you, even if you just want somebody who understands why you like Wallace. I mean, that's a lie. He didn't like Wallace. He didn't like Wallace at all, and not but a week earlier, 2 weeks earlier, he'd been over here trying to make sure that his friend didn't marry Wallace. But now that he saw that didn't play out and he thought that might be a bit dodgy and he didn't want to get around that he had done that, now all of a sudden he wants to say, hey man, I'm really sorry you're going through this. Oh, I hate it. I hate it so much for you. I mean, I hate that the only thing I can do is basically verbally berate people when they decide to say a word against you, which I would totally do if I had to. But I don't want to bother you. I know. I just want to let you know you got a friend out there. You got a friend in me. Okay. The reality is that Dickie can see it would probably be best for England and for all of Great Britain if David went on his way. So he's now going to sort of encourage this whole wild, harebrained idea of running off with Wallace Simpson because at the end of the day, yeah, that probably would be best for everyone. Edward's three brothers, Dickie and the king's legal advisor, Walter Monckton, met at Fort Belvedere on December 10th. Dickie down at the fort all day where chaos reigns, wrote Edwina in her diary. Everyone completely sunk, except the king, who seems fairly calm and cheerful. We remember reading about that in Traitor King. Everybody is wringing their hands beside themselves, woeful, crying, weeping. And David acts like it's the best day of the year. Dickie's feelings were torn. Why so loyal to his old friend, he could see his faults and unfitness to rule. He'd also had a growing respect for Bertie and recognized that his more low-key qualities, his decency and sense of public service might actually make for the better king. The next day, Edward announced he was abdicating in favor of his younger brother Bertie. The crisis was over. Well, yes, it is over. And then that leaves Dickie free to begin a more meaningful relationship with the current king, right? He's going to start distancing himself from David. And of course, David is physically distanced from him because David is sort of exiled and is going to be wandering about Austria for a good bit. So now Dickie can settle into getting to know the new king and his family. In January, Dickie was appointed the new king's personal naval ADC and invested with the GCVO. Tea with Queen Mary at Marlborough House, Edwina wrote on February 9th, and cocktails with the king and queen at Piccadilly. The only moved to Buckingham Palace next week. Princess Elizabeth and Margaret came to tea at Brooke House, showed them Mickey Mouse films as we were trying at the cinema, confided Edwina to her diary. So isn't that cozy? You got the little princesses watching TV at your house, king and queen, taking tea, all of this. I mean, it's like they really have settled themselves in the upper echelons, haven't they? Meanwhile, Dickie's not ready to write David off completely. The Mountbattens were quickly adapting to the new regime, while also trying to keep in with Edward, now the Duke of Windsor. In March, after seeing Yola in Paris, Dickie flew to see Edward, staying at Schloss Ensfield near Vienna with Fruity Metcalf. Talking with David and Fruity nearly all day. Important talk with David and possibly a return, Dickie confided in his diary. Very sad saying goodbye on both sides. Apparently, he was so distraught that on the way to the airplane, he threw up. That's some emotional distress right there. But I can't understand why you would. I mean, if David wants to go his way, let him go his way. You're still friends with the new king. And if Dickie is all about climbing that ladder, that seems like he hasn't missed a step. I just can't imagine taking on the woes of your friend to such an extent that you would be throwing up when it's like his friend didn't have to find himself in this spot. I can imagine being sick for a friend, like really sick for a friend, if something really terrible had happened, like their child had just been run over by a car, or they just found out a cancer diagnosis, or something like that was completely out of their control. But I can't imagine being sick for a friend when they had made poor choice after poor choice after poor choice after being counseled and led to better ideas. That's their friend's fault. Maybe I'm just hard-hearted, but it's like, really? All right, well, Dickie writes a thank you note to David. He's got to make sure he stays in those good graces. Thank you so much for the very pleasant 2-day visit at Schloss Ensfield. It was very nice seeing you again, and it felt quite like old times, you, Fruity, and I being alone together, wrote Dickie to Edward on his return, giving him some of the coronation plans. I went and I saw Bertie today. He was very friendly and delighted to have good news of you. So here Dickie is standing in the middle. He's trying to make all these inroads between all parties, wants to stay on everybody's good side, which, is it even possible? No. And we're about to see that it isn't, because he knows he can't go to the wedding. I mean, he already knew that way back when he was like, yeah, thanks for the invite. I'll definitely come if I can. He knew he was never going to come. He hadn't sorted out how he was going to explain that he wasn't going to come. He finally hits on an idea, and we remember this very passage from Trader King. Dickie would later claim that he had twice offered to be best man, but Edward had hoped that his 2 younger brothers, in royal tradition, would be there as supporters. He had certainly given the impression that he hoped to attend. He wrote to David and said, "You will have heard that although I succeeded in fixing a date for your wedding that suited Bertie, George, etc., that other people stepped in and have produced a situation that has made all your friends very unhappy. I have made several attempts to get matters put right, but at present I cannot even accept your kind invitation myself. I haven't quite given up all hope yet, though my chances don't look too good. I'll write again when I know, finally." Well, he already knew. This is all just lies and smoke and mirrors, to keep David on your good side and make sure he's not mad at you. But you're not going to come, and that it didn't take much convincing. All they had to say was, well, if you go over there and hang out with them, then I guess you've shown your loyalty. And Dickie would have been like, oh, I didn't mean it. I'm sorry. I take it back. But then, of course, he's got to write to David and pander to him and be like, "I'm sorry, man. I really tried. Really tried. I promise you I did." It appears that he and the royal brothers were warned off by royal courtiers, but Dickie sent 3 old English pieces of plate, a 1633 wine flagon, a 1718 and 1731 tankard as wedding gifts, writing, "I thought so much of you today, and the great joy must be to you to be with Wallace again." He certainly knows the right things to say to people, I'll give him that. As a manipulator, he's pretty top-notch. I mean, I think of any savvy person would realize that this guy was a real leech and had learned what you wanted to hear. But if you wanted to have somebody tickle your ear and give you all sorts of ear candy, Dickie knew how to do it. All right, on to Edwina. What's she doing? Same thing she always does.
"I'm tired of being here. This is boring. It's cold. I want to have the sun. I want to have the heat."
So she's decided to go hang out with her lover, Bunny. And she, Jack, Nada, and Bunny all decide they're going to go hang out in Africa for a good bit. So they get an open Buick with a Ford van for the luggage, and they toured Uganda, the Belgian Congo, and Kenya. While she's prancing all over Africa, she picks herself up a 3-month-old lion cub. "His name is Sabi. His mother was shot for attacking a man and poaching cattle. We simply had to bring him back with us." So they added that cub to the menagerie of the animals at Adstein. Who was enjoying all these wild animals? Who was having to take care of these, I ask you? I have 1 dog, and I'm beside myself with the responsibility. I can't imagine a lion cub, a bear, all the other things that they have. We know about the bear, we know about the lion cub, and if all they had was the bear and the lion cub, I'd be thrown back. Well, at least this time, she managed to bring back the lion cub and get herself home in time for her kid's birthday. I guess that's something. Now, in 1936, Bunny had commissioned a 3-masted schooner from a Cornish boat builder, which he and Edwina called Lost Horizon. And they all had plans that the Mountbattens and Yola would join Bunny in the West Indies in January, where Dickie was captaining an English team in an international polo tournament. But no sooner had they arrived when Nada rang with the news that Georgie had been diagnosed with bone marrow cancer. This really tore Dickie up. You remember, he and George were really close. George had invited him, when Dickie had been in school, George had invited him to spend holidays with him on the destroyer that he worked on. And he really looked to his brother to sort of shape and mold him as a man, especially since their dad had passed away. So now to lose his brother was more than he could bear. He wrote, "I am so utterly wretched and heartbroken. I haven't been able to think of anything but poor dear Georgie since Nada telephoned." Dickie wrote to his mother, "I've been just like a baby, cry myself to sleep almost every night, a thing I haven't done since Papa died. Edwina's been a perfect brick. Oh, why does God punish the good and sweet people of the world like George and let the cards and swines like Bobby Cunningham Reed flourish?" You'll recall that Bobby Cunningham Reed was the person who married Edwina's sister Mary. He was this sort of loser who had wiggled his way into Mary's affections. He didn't really have any money, and he saw somebody who did, and somebody who was mentally unwell, and saw that this would be a great card to play. So that's probably what Dickie's referring to by being sad that his brother should die, yet his brother-in-law seems to remain with us in good health. It was clear that Edwina could not continue her holiday with Bunny. The Mountbattens returned to Britain. Georgie died on April 8th. He was 45. Dickie was devastated. The sweetest-natured, most charming, most able, most brilliant, entirely lovable brother anyone ever had is lost. 8 years younger, he had worshipped his brother with his charm, quick intelligence, and an engaging sense of humor. He had inspired Dickie's own interest in a career in the Navy as well as in electronics and film. He was the sort of person who, instead of reading detective stories, would read problems of higher calculus and solve them in his head. Reputedly, he did the Times crossword in 10 minutes. In spite of being one of the youngest commanders in the Navy, Georgie decided he needed to make some money and had left the service in 1930. After a period working in a brokerage house at Wall Street, he became chairman and managing director of the British Sperry Gyroscope Company, an electronics company specializing in advanced aircraft navigation equipment, and director of Electrolux, where his brother-in-law Harold Werner was chairman, Marks and Spencer, and other various companies. His chief interest, however, was his model railway system, with its 2 miles of track, built in a converted barn at his home in Leyden Manor, near Maidenhead, which was finished in 1929. He spent over £60,000 on his little railway system, and of course he had all the hills of papier-mâché, and the little goods sheds, and the little forests, and the mountain ranges that were supposed to look like imitation ice. But that was not his only hobby. Good boy though Georgie may have been, there was a dark side to George. He had inherited from his father, so this runs in the family, one of the most comprehensive pornographic book collections in Europe. What an inheritance from one's father. The library contained albums of photographs of various individuals and groups having sexual intercourse in every possible position, as well as books on sadomasochism, bondage, whipping, thumb screws, and racks. What? Okay, bearing that in mind, listen to this next passage. Georgie had hitherto largely been responsible for the education of his nephew Philip. What Philip do you think I'm referring to? Oh, just Queen Elizabeth's future husband. Well, now that Georgie's died, who should take over? Dickie. The responsibility of looking after the nephew Philip fell to Dickie. Philip's father, Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, had gone into exile in France in 1922, shortly after his son's birth. In 1930, Philip's mother Alice had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and was sent to a Swiss sanatorium where a fellow inmate was Václav Nijinsky, the ballet dancer and choreographer. Though eventually recovered, she had separated from her husband, who preferred the company of his mistress in Monte Carlo. Philip had been sent to prep school just outside London before going to Gordonston in the north of Scotland. He had hitherto divided his holidays between his grandmother, Princess Victoria, Georgie, Harold Verner, and sometimes Dickie. Dickie was very good at that time, too, Philip remembered. I used to see a lot of him, though he was often away for a long time. It was he who persuaded Philip to join the Navy rather than the Air Force. Dickie wrote to Edwina and said, Philip was here all last week doing his entrance exams for the Navy. He had his meals with us, and he really is killingly funny. I like him very much. So, effectively, Philip was the son that Dickie never had. And he treated him like that. And it really makes you wonder what poor Philip had to endure at the hands of these people. I'm not saying that they did anything to him, but I'm not saying they didn't. What a weird group of people. You know, that library containing all of those books illustrating various darknesses must have been shown or lent to Edward VIII at some point. They must have all looked at these because a lot of that stuff he was into. And so was his wife. And you just wonder how many people in this group were just a bunch of sickos. Who passes down their collection of pornographic books to their son? And if the grown-ups are all into that, how long is it going to take before they introduce you to all that? I hope Philip was okay. All right, continuing on. The winter of 1938 to 39 saw Mountbatten embark on a series of fast-track staff courses at the Royal Naval War College at Greenwich and the Higher Command course at Aldershot, studying alongside 7 major generals, Claude, Auchinleck, and the Indian Army. And for years, he had been socializing with senior naval officers and politicians. But the course provided a more structured opportunity to network with senior personnel across all the armed services. So just his cup of tea. Though on paper only a junior captain, Dickie wielded influence that was disproportionate to his rank. Not only did he socialize with senior service officers, but also important politicians, notably Anthony Eden and Alfred Duff Cooper. He had never been shy about using his connections to promote his own career, but increasingly now it was directed at shaping government policy. He had congratulated Eden when he resigned in February 1938 in protest at the proposed settlement with Mussolini over Italy's invasion of Abyssinia, and a few months later Eden wrote to Broadlands to discuss a letter he was intending to send to the Times. When Duff Cooper resigned as First Lord of the Admiralty over the Munich settlement, Dickie, a critic of appeasement, wrote to congratulate him. I fear this is a long-winded letter, the first I've ever written on a political event, but your behavior has been a real inspiration to me. But then, of course, though he wrote congratulatory word, he couldn't help sort of stepping in to see if he couldn't get a little something out of this. He writes, next time I see you, I must ask who is likely to get next C&C in the Mediterranean as I hope to go out there next year. So, he's always wheeling and dealing, slicing and dicing. He's just trying to all the day long make something happen for himself. And you just have to ask yourself, how genuine could a person like that be? Who is the real person behind all of this maneuvering? Things across Europe were going very poorly, but in some ways, this was a real call to action for Edwina, because she's played long enough, right? And in her travels, she has, not surprisingly, come across a lot of suffering of other people. And now as the continent is beginning to erupt in contention, she sees that perhaps there might be people who could use her money and her time. And for once, she decides to step in and try to do a little something for somebody other than herself and her raging sexual needs. The book goes on to say that the worsening political situation in 1938, with growing tensions in Germany and Italy, had galvanized Edwina, who had rewritten her will after Munich. Her travels had opened her eyes to the suffering of the world, and she increasingly wanted to do something more useful with her life. Thank God she's finally come around to something other than,
I want another boyfriend.
She started to learn first aid and approached the Red Cross about turning Adsdean into a hospital and, quote, running it as a commandant myself. She joined the Red Cross Committee, run by a friend, Eileen Sutherland, did 6 months auxiliary nursing in wards, theaters, and the outpatients department of the Westminster Hospital, and passed her first aid examinations. Dickie had his vocation, and now Edwina was finding hers too. I'm not even joking. I am thrilled for her. Truly and legitimately, I'm so happy for her because everything she's been doing so far has had to be so hollow. To finally have something that had meaning and purpose for other people is going to create a place of happiness that she would never have found just doing what she wanted all the time. Being of service to other people is taxing and tiring, and sometimes you don't realize how much good you're doing and how happy it makes you to serve other people until the day is over. In the midst of it, sometimes you don't realize, but when the day is over, you feel happy that you spent your day in the aid of others instead of just sitting there doing whatever you wanted for the umpteenth day in a row. Still, just because she was deciding to help others didn't mean she stopped traveling. I don't think that she was able to stay home. She had this really restless spirit, and Benny loved to travel too and seemingly never had anything to do but hang out with her. I don't know how he's going to keep all this money. I guess he just has some real good investment situations going because he does not seem to work. But she and he traveled all over the world. I won't bore you with all the places they went. This time they're going all the way to the far stretches of the earth in New Guinea. And at one point, they decided that they were going to drive along the 700-mile road being built between Burma and southwest China. Much of it could only be managed by lorry, not more than 10 to 15 miles per hour being possible for hours on end, she told Dickie, bottom gear being used for long stretches. What's interesting is she was the first woman to ever have gone on that particular journey, so I suppose her adventuresome spirit did lead her to interesting things. Finally, they make it to New Guinea. That had been their plan all along. When they couldn't get on the boat to New Guinea, that's when they went on this long drive from Burma to the southwest China. But finally, they get on a boat. They go to Dutch New Guinea. And she made an excuse for herself to Dickie, being like, I was so close. I wanted to do it for so long, right? I mean, how could I miss this opportunity? I know I'm missing our kid's birthday, okay? Like, don't sue me. But if you were here, you'd wanted to go for so long, you'd do it too. So I'll make it up to her. Not only did she miss Pamela's birthday, but also Easter and the holidays. But having come all this way, it's a pity to miss it, she says. She returned at the beginning of May, bringing with her a pair of wallabies, Dobo and Bobo, to replace Sabi, who had died shortly before she left. That was the lion cub. So, one lion's out, let's get a couple of wallabies up in this joint. Because that's what you need. That's what everyone needs. Her kids and all her animals, but never she's there to take care of them. Anyway, almost immediately she was facing her own family crisis. Her father, Wilfred, now in his 70s, announced he was leaving Molly to go off with a French woman. What a nut job her dad has been this whole time. He has been an insane person. Is it any wonder that both of his daughters are insane also? Who in their 70s decides to finally leave the wife that they haven't loved for at any point in his marriage? I don't think he was ever that into Molly. He wanted to leave her all this time. Everyone's like, no, don't do that. Just stick with it. And then in his 70s, he's like, the hell with it. I deserve happiness too. And so he decides to go off with this French woman. Are you for real right now? Come on, man. Like, how's that? Play that out in your mind, old man. How's that really going to go? You're going to enjoy her for 1 second and then have a heart attack in the middle of it? I mean, come on. Anyway, Edwina counseled him to stay in the marriage, but what most shocked her was not his behavior, but his appearance. He had Parkinson's disease and looked very ill. Of course, a few weeks later, he died. Much to nobody's surprise. Terribly sad losing Daddy, she wrote in her diary, and really heartbroken, but I feel for his sake that it was for the best, as he could never have stood a long illness and invalidism. She had never been that close to him, but now she was an orphan, and his death was a break with the past. It had brought on fresh responsibilities with the ownership and management of the entire Broadlands estate. And of course, that responsibility would fall to her because her sister Mary is out to lunch once again. Another family problem was her sister Mary, who now had 2 sons with Bobby Cunningham Reed. On marriage, they had moved to the Hall, 6 mile bottom, about 8,000 acres, a swimming pool and tennis courts, so they entertained widely, all captured on cinefilms, including Vivian Leigh, Laurence Olivier, and Neville Chamberlain. They were really hobnobbing. Bobby had set up Criterion Films with Douglas Fairbanks Jr., which brought a steady supply of attractive young women. This and the fact that on their honeymoon, Mary had insisted they share their wealth because no decent woman likes to have a man live with her in charity, was to be the cause of their problems. Remember, he had shown up penniless, and when the family was like, okay, produce at least 10,000 pounds so we know that you aren't just here for Mary's money, he'd promptly gone out and borrowed the money and then showed the family, look, I have 10,000 pounds. Not of your own money, you don't. Anyway, of course, on the honeymoon, Mary, who's in La La Land half the time, says to him, let's just all share the money. Don't worry about it. What's mine is yours, which sounds nice, but not when you've married a nut. In December 1936, Mary had left Bobby, citing his adultery with 3 different women, and moved with her lady's maid, Eleanor Smith, into Brookhouse. 13 months later, Bobby brought an action against his wife and the Chancery Court, claiming he was entitled to income under deeds signed when they had first married. Mary decided to go to court in order to revoke some of the arrangements. Cunningham Reed defended the action, instructing the Labour politician Sir Sandford Cripps, while Sir Patrick Hastings acted for Mary. Eventually, the case was settled, probably to save more dirty linen being washed in public. Cunningham Reed became one of the first men to be paid alimony, receiving £10,000 a year, as well as the house in Upper Brook Street and the yacht. He did not, however, have it index-linked. In 1939, they secured a decree nisi made absolute in March 1940, not on the grounds of his adultery, but of hers, with the French film star Henry Garat. It said that Bobby himself had taken the incriminating photo. I don't have a lot of details about how he got that photo. Did they know he was taking it and then he used it against them? Was it like a weird situation where it's like, let's all just be together and Bobby was taking the picture? Or had he snuck up on them and took it without them knowing? I don't know. The book doesn't say. Either way, this Cunningham Reed was a snake, and I can understand now why Dickie was lamenting the fact that his brother died, but Cunningham Reed continues to stroll about and breathe the good air that God gave us. Finally, the chapter ends by saying that throughout the spring and summer of 1939, refugees streamed into Britain. Edwina was keen to assist whom she could, enlisting Dickie's help to write letters to various British authorities. She sent money to various organizations, and in particular the German Jewish Aid Committee, the Federation of Czechoslovakian Jews, and the Jewish Refugees Committee, as she began to take a closer interest in her Jewish heritage. In mid-August, Bunny had arranged to take his Talbot to be serviced in France, and Edwina decided to join him. Friends thought them mad, but she felt that there was time for one more adventure. Well, they were flitting all over Paris and across the French countryside. Bunny was suddenly appointed ADC to General Lloyd and was called up, and so they darted back. Finally, he's got some work. While he took up his new responsibility, she frantically arranged for valuables, including the Whistler murals from Brookhouse, to be sent to Broadlands, and herself moved from the vulnerable penthouse in Kensington Palace with her mother-in-law. The Rolls and Hispano were replaced by a more practical Austin 12. On September 3rd, war was declared. It would prove to be the making of both Dickie and Edwina. Trouble brews with this lot, doesn't it? Trouble brews with this lot. I just feel like there's so many things coming at us. I have not read ahead, so I don't know. But there were some revelations in this chapter that really surprised me and really helped me to understand a little bit more about what we can expect from Dickie. You know, up until this point, he's seemed like a pretty nice fellow, a bit naive, but nice in general. Hardworking, putting his head down, trying to make the best of having a scandalous wife. But now I feel like we've seen some manipulation from him. And now, knowing that his brother George had one of the most prolific collections of pornography, it just lends one to wonder. What's going to be showing behind the scenes? This manipulative individual who also seems to have, if not his own bent towards the darkness that we've heard about yet, certainly has been kin to it. And I just wonder what manipulation and deviance can do to sort of help you scale the upper echelons of society. I'm not saying he was into blackmailing, but I'm also not saying he isn't. It would make real good sense that if you happen to be a manipulative person and you also have access to a lot of dark themed ideas, that you might decide to marry the two and see what you might make of it. Who knows? That's just my speculation. I don't know. I haven't read ahead, but we'll find out together. All right. I'll see you guys later this week. Thank you so much to those of you who have enjoyed the new content, and for those of you who have not and who have let me know, don't worry. We're not done with this book. We're going to finish this book. So I'll just be putting out more content as the summer months open up and I'm not teaching anymore. So expect to see a variety on this channel. Don't worry. I would let you know if we weren't finishing a book. I put out an announcement on the last one that we didn't finish, the Diana book. So I would not leave you hanging. I don't think that the general population is enjoying the Mountbatten book. And I think it would be good for my channel to talk about some more relevant subjects along with the Mountbatten book. So I will be doing that, but don't worry. We're still reading this one as well. All right, I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.